Hi everyone, in this video I will explain to you what the difference between cold electricity, radiant energy, dielectricity or static electricity is. And as you might know, there is no difference between these four terms. These four terms are just different names for one and the same thing. I personally like to call it dielectricity. As I did in my last video, there I explained very well what dielectricity is and what the phenomenon of it is. I will show you in this video again, so stay with me. And here I have a schematic of Tesla's hairpin circuit that uses cold electricity, or a lot of people like to call this cold electricity because you can touch the circuit directly without getting electrocuted. That is where the name cold electricity comes from, but it is exactly the same as, for example, radiant energy. And here I have a schematic of a classic Tesla coil, a spark gap Tesla coil. And here the term radiant energy is used a lot, but it's also just dielectricity or electrostatics. It's all the same thing, just different names for it. As you can see, the principle is always the same. We have a high voltage capacitor that gets charged to a high voltage, and we have a spark gap attached to it. And the principle how this works is, if the voltage in the high voltage capacitor is high enough, the spark gap will produce a spark, because in air we have at around 1 kilovolts you have to have a distance in your spark gap of 1 millimeter for a spark to appear. That's just roughly, but yeah. So what happens is, if the voltage gets high enough, a spark will appear and discharge this capacitor. And when that happened, the voltage is 0 and it will get charged up again until the voltage is high enough again, and a spark will appear and discharge it again. And this happens like multiple hundred times a second, or even often, depending on the frequency you use. And this produces dielectricity or electrostatics or cold electricity or radiant energy, whatever you want to call it. It is the same thing. Basically, it is in easy terms explained electricity without a magnetic part, or electricity without amperes. Seems illogic, because in normal electric devices we don't have that phenomenon, except for in a capacitor. And this is what I'm going to show you now. I'm giving you a practical example of how this cold electricity works and what it is. So here you see my setup. It's a high voltage impulse generator, and yeah, if you want to know how it works, watch my older videos. There I've explained it. And let's start it by explaining how the setup works. So I have here a full bridge rectifier and some capacitors and a spark gap, and this is powered with high voltage. And if I turn it on, I'm using an input power of around 10 volts now, and this charges up my capacitors. And if I discharge it, I get a spark. And this is exactly the same what happens with a Tesla hairpin circuit or a spark gap Tesla coil. Only difference is I do it manually, like one time every 2 seconds, and with these other setups it happens very often per 1 second, like 100 times a second. This is the difference. But this phenomenon that you see here is called electricity, or radiant energy, or dielectricity. It's all the same, or a very common term is static electricity. This is what you get when you have some plastic fibers on you in your clothing and you touch some metal surface, you get slightly shocked. I think everyone has experienced that phenomenon before. This is exactly the same as cold electricity. Yeah. But as always, don't get tricked. Be careful. Cold electricity in a hairpin circuit is quite safe to touch because of the characteristics of this setup itself, but don't get confused and think that this is always safe to touch, because like here we have a high voltage potential in these capacitors, and this is not safe to touch. If I would touch this, this would shock me quite bad. And if I use high voltage, this would be dangerous, as you can see here. Yeah, I think that is all I can say to this topic. I hope that made it clear what cold electricity is, or radiant energy. I keep using the same for terms for describing the exact same phenomenon. I hope this cleared up some things. Alright, thanks for watching. Goodbye.